Hi everyone, and welcome to today's seminar hosted by the International Inequalities Institute at LSE. My name is Michael Vaughan, and I'm a research fellow here at the III. I'm really pleased today to be able to chair today's seminar titled Unequal Estate Division Wealth Perpetuation, Portfolios, Primogeniture and Patrilineality, which is part of the III Inequalities seminar series. Today's speaker is Dr. Nhat and Trinh. Nhat and Trinh is a research officer at the Institute for New Economic Thinking and the Department of Social Policy and Intervention at the University of Oxford. She is also a non-stipendiary research fellow at Nuffield College at the University of Oxford. So could I ask the online audience to please keep yourselves muted? There will be a chance for you to pose questions following the presentation, although I've been told if you would like urgent clarification, you can signal during the presentation. We'll take questions at the end from both in-person and online audience. So I'll now hand over to Nhat Ann. Many thanks and enjoy the event.
Thank you, Michael. And thank you for the kind invitation to present here at the Inequality Seminar Series. Thanks for the introduction and thank you in the room and online for joining today. There has been a slight change in the title, but I hope that you're not too disappointed. So my co-authors, Daria Tisch and Manuel Schächter, have decided to apply some changes, but it's really the same study. So I hope that after you will take something out of the seminar. So in this paper, we study how families transfer wealth from one generation to the next, and in particular, we focus on how patterns and practices of inheritances can be linked to wealth perpetuation and the persistence in wealth inequalities over time. So wealth is the stock of assets that one earns at a given moment in time. This can include savings in a bank account, private real estate property, or shares in private companies. It is therefore very, very different from earnings or income, which are flows, because wealth is a stock rather than flows. It also has different functions compared to income and earnings. The first one is that wealth provides a security net for rainy days, but also opportunities to engage in economic activities, business activities, or investments into education. It generates further income through capital income. It brings social status for people who own wealth and power over those who own less. And importantly, it can be transmitted directly from one generation to the next, which is not the case, for instance, in field of education or occupation or earnings. Furthermore, wealth also strongly persists across generations. This means that research has found that the relationship between parents' wealth and children's wealth is very, very strong, more so than in other socioeconomic status dimensions, including education, income, and occupation. And the strong relationship between parents' wealth and their children's wealth has been particularly shown at the very top of the distribution. So there we see a very strong relationship and a lot of reproduction. And what we would also like to highlight is, and what this study is mainly about, is that wealth transmission follows the logic of its own. So there are certain inheritance practices that shape how wealth is perpetuated over time. And interestingly, recent research has shown that transfers are made often unequally within families. And before I dive more deeply into this, let me speak a little bit about the relationship between wealth transfers and inequality. So wealth transfers, and here I mean inheritances or interlegal gifts, are an important channel through which wealth is perpetuated intergenerationally. This direct transferability has been shown to contribute largely to wealth persistence. So for instance, if we look to Sweden, for instance, it has been shown that 50% of the correlation between parents and their children's wealth can be explained by intergenerational transfers. But wealth transfers not only have an impact on the intergenerational persistence, but they also shape the unequal distribution of wealth at a given point in time. So for instance, if we look at a study that has examined European countries and the US, around 26 to 36% of overall wealth inequality can be attributed to inheritances and gifts. And if we look more closely at the US, for instance, the share of wealth held by the richest 10% of Americans would indeed fall from around 75% to less than 60% if transfers were allocated equally. And wealth transfers, as I said earlier, are very relevant for the social reproduction of highly advantaged families, not only because receiving inheritance substantially increases one's position in the wealth distribution, but obviously because families who are more privileged and advantaged are also more likely to transfer larger sums of wealth across generations. So in the study, we pursue three main goals. Overall, we seek to examine how intergenerational wealth transfers lead to wealth perpetuation, and we focus on first the prevalence of unequal estate division, because we think that unequal estate division is one of the main channels through which families create inequality between, within themselves, but also more broadly and within society. Then we look at the relative importance of different practices leading to unequal estate division. And then we would like to look at the effects of unequal estate division on the distribution of intergenerational transfers. So our research, we have three research questions, which are fairly straightforward. To what extent are estates unequally divided? Which practices drive the unequal division of estates? And what is the impact of unequal estate division on inequality in inheritance? So these are the three research questions that we asked in this study. So there has been, compared to earlier historical periods, norms of equality are more widespread nowadays, influencing attitudes in support of equality also within families. As a result, there is now widely held belief that parents should treat their children equally to foster unity, fairness, and collective responsibility among siblings. Equally, institutions like the tax systems or inheritance law that regulates the transmission of wealth across generations is in support of shared bequests, so that wealth ought to be distributed equally among surviving spouses or children of the deceased. However, when we look into empirical research, inequalities in inheritance are actually more common than these beliefs and sets of rules would suggest. And we have studies on Sweden showing that it's around 30 to 15% of estates that are distributed unequally, but actually when we look at the US, the share is much higher, with around 20 to even 50% of all bequests that are made unequally. And shifting from actual behavior to attitudes, there's also been a study that has shown that it's around 40% of parents who hold unequal bequest intentions. So it's both behavior, but also if we look at the wealth, how they would like to transfer the wealth, they say, oh, they would want to transfer it unequally among their children. So why would families want to transfer wealth unequally, and what kind of implications would this have? So the unequal division of estates prevents family wealth from being split up or broken apart. So if you were to split it either between your children, then the wealth isn't kept together, but is kind of diluted as it passes through the generation by being broken apart more and more among the children. And therefore, if wealth is divided unequally or in unity or passed in unity from one generation to the next, this enables long-running wealth participation. And it also fosters particularly wealth concentration at the top and the establishment or a protection of established wealth dynasties over time. Historically, there were actually also some legal restrictions that allowed or that protected the impartibility of estates, so meaning that estates ought to be passed in unity or as a whole across generations. This was mostly the case for farmland or larger properties, and in the UK or in England, there's examples like the fee tails or the entails that were, however, abolished in the early 20th century. But interestingly, impartible inheritance has been found to be still practiced today. So there's been a study on France that shows that despite the law requiring shared inheritance among children, certain assets called by Patrilineality and Civil Gulag as so-called structuring assets that are family businesses or firms and house property, these kinds of assets are actually also transferred unequally or in a whole to one child only. So we have impartible inheritance despite regulations on inheritance. So how do families now achieve, or what kind of practices underlie this unequal estate division? We would like to highlight particularly two practices. The first one is primogeniture. So here the idea that the first one has the right to inherit the majority or all of the family's wealth. It's essentially a very old principle that can be still observed in existing aristocracies. And the second practice that we would like to highlight is patrilineality, which is according to which family wealth and property is passed from fathers to sons. So it goes through the male line of the family, and often patrilineality is combined with primogeniture. So that's the firstborn son who is identified or who acts as the primary heir of the family estate. We would also argue that besides these practices, there are certain characteristics of the estate that make unequal estate division more likely, or where we expect to observe it more clearly. And the first one, building here on work by Vaughan and Gulag, is the presence of structuring assets. So here the idea is there are certain assets within the family estate that carry certain symbolic or economic value for the family. In their book, they mostly focus on land businesses and real estate property. So we are going to follow their suggestion on structuring assets. And the way, because there's rules actually that prevent families from transferring it only to one child, they show that reverse accounting can be a strategy to circumvent these legal requirements and achieve unequal estate division nevertheless. And so here the argument is really about the types of assets, so the portfolio composition of the estate that drive unequal estate division, which should act across the social background of the family or the position of the family within the distribution. But obviously these two are related, and therefore we would also expect that unequal division of estate is more pronounced the higher the position in the overall wealth or estate distribution. This can be linked to several reasons. So first of all, more affluent families seem to have a higher incentive to perpetuate their wealth. There's this idea of the establishment or continuation of a dynasty among the rich, or the families that achieve a certain level of wealth. At some point, they seek to protect it and remain wealthy over time, and therefore establish dynasties. And also they need to keep their wealth together in order to avoid intergenerational downward mobility. So this is why unequal estate division on the family level, at least, so this can be to the disadvantage of single members within the family, will be kept together and only pass to one family member in order for the family line to remain at the top of the wealth distribution in the long. So we are going to use German data to test unequal, or to look at the unequal division of the state and the underlying practices. So let me tell you a little bit about the German context. In fact, Germany is an unlikely case to observe unequal wealth transmission. This has to do with the fact that in the absence of a will, there is a statutory inheritance quota that requires the equal division among surviving kin. This is very similar to the UK. But there's another restriction on the freedom of disinheritance. So in Germany, there is the so-called statutory minimum share. So even if a testator decides to give only one their entire estate to one child, the remaining children have a claim to 50% of their statutory share. So there's this, yes, statutory minimum share that prevents or that should prevent unequal division among siblings. There's a further characteristic that made unequal division unlikely. So in Germany, in contrast to the UK, where estates are taxed as a whole, inheritance tax is levied on the inherited. So, and the tax is progressive, meaning that this would incentivize parents to split up their wealth in several parts in order to pay lower tax rates, compared to a scenario where the entire estate would be transferred as a whole. But as can obviously also voluntarily waive their legal entitlement. So this is something that families might decide amongst themselves. And there's also this one legal instrument, so-called predefined inheritances, where testators can designate specific assets in their estates to be inherited by an individual of their choice without crediting it against the inheritance share. So there's predefined inheritance can be seen as a legal instrument to support unequal division of the state. But overall, we would argue that Germany is a rather unlikely case compared to the US or the UK, for instance, where there's full freedom of or full testimony freedom and therefore also full freedom of disinheritance. So in Germany, this is limited. So we are using German inheritance and gifts tax register data, meaning that this includes all estates for which the inheritance or gifts tax was assessed between 2007 and 2020. It contains information on the exact division of the estate, so the size, amount, and value of inheritances between for the recipient, and also the type of assets that they receive. And it also contains information on some socio-demographic characteristics of testators and recipients that we use. Another advantage of this tax data is that it covers the full top of the estate distribution, so which is normally missed in survey data on inheritances and interlegal gifts. So to give you an idea, we have around we cover around 30% of all transfers and around 73% of all transferred wealth. So this limitation is because inheritance tax is levied for inheritance above 400,000 euros, so there's a threshold. But obviously we still observe the large chunk of wealth that is overall transferred. We mainly focus on estates and inheritances that are transferred from parents to children, so intergenerational transfers. But in additional analysis, we can link these inheritances or bequests through gifts from the same donor to the same recipient in the observation period to see whether there are some important mechanisms at play that can be linked to compensation transfers, for instance, or compensatory transfers. But I won't talk about these here because the results are very similar when we also include the gift. So this is why here I will focus on the results based on inheritances and bequests. So here's a sample of the estate contained in our data. So looking at the first row, the median value of inheritances is around 550,000 euros. So this reflects that, yeah, we're looking at very valuable estates. If we look at the share of estates with specific assets, we see that 73%, so a large chunk of estates contains real estate wealth, but also 30% and 15% contain business or land and forest wealth. On average, estates are received by around 1.44 heirs, and due to different mortality rates, the share of female testators is slightly larger than the share of male testators with 54%.
So by that, do you mean it's more likely to go to a female spouse?
are given by women. So this is the gender of the testate. Yes. Yes.
What is other wealth that is shared with other wealth?
Other wealth includes a wealth that is not, it's neither business, real estate, or land. So
Does
it,
that mean stocks? Like-
yeah, it can include stocks, it can include cash, and it's mostly indeed cash or, yeah. We have two measures of unequal division. So the first one looks at the inheritance value that children receive. So we have a dummy indicating whether transfers are divided equally or not between children on the estate level. Because so we look at exactly unequal division, but because this is a very strict definition of unequal division and doesn't take into account rounding differences. For instance, we also run our analysis with a slightly looser definition of unequal division, where we look at deviations larger than 2% of the mean inheritances. We also calculate the coefficient of variation in inheritance value in order to not only get whether estates are divided equally or not, but also at the intensities of how unequally are inheritances divided between children, which is divided as the standard deviation by the mean of the transfer value. And as I said earlier, in German inheritance law, there's the possibility of defining these predefined inheritances. So we look also at the share of estates that include these predefined inheritances indicated by a dummy, which takes one if the estate contains a predefined inheritance and the rest does not. Our analysis proceeds in 3 steps. So first of all, we provide descriptive statistics on the likelihood of unequal division. This is done or calculated on the level of estates and separate estate components, because we are also making the argument that it is more salient and more pronounced in the presence of certain assets, like family businesses or business in general, and land or real estate. And we do it, but also by the portfolio composition and the share of structuring assets, as I said, and along the estate distribution, in order to see whether there's significant variation depending on lower estates with lower or higher value. In order to look more at the practices that underlie unequal estate division, we run estate fixed effects regression model to test for primogeniture and patrilineality. Here, the outcome variable is the inheritance value received by the heirs within the estates. And the main explanatory variables are the birth order and the gender of heirs. So here, the recipients. We further include interactions with the presence of structuring assets to see whether this makes a difference, and also the gender of the testator to see whether it makes a difference of whether it's a woman or a man who is leaving the bequest. And in order to address our third research question, we run a counterfactual analysis by comparing the observed distribution of inheritances to a distribution where we assume that all siblings receive the same inheritance from their parents, and we compare these two distributions to kind of get at the effect, or like the extent to which unequal estate divisions within family have an impact on overall inheritance inequality. Okay, let me go to the results then. So the first research question being, to what extent are estates unequally divided? So here, if we look at the first row, we and focus on estates that are given to at least 2 or more children. We see that it's around 38% of estates in Germany that are divided unequally. If we think about the numbers that I presented on Sweden and the US, this is actually quite substantial.
Can you remind us what unequal means then?
Here, unequal means it's a dummy saying whether the estate is divided, so whether children get the same amount or not within the estate.
It's just that
Yes.
it's 51-49. That's
Yes, yes, but the results are very similar actually when we apply the SLUSA definition of inequality. Yeah. And if we look at how certain assets or assets are transferred, we find that business transfers and land transfers are slightly more unequally divided than real estate transfers. So for business transfers and land transfers, it's around 12 to 11% of transfers that are made unequally compared to 10%. And again, it's only 9% for transfers of other wealth, which is mainly cash. And in the overall sample, we find that 18% of estates include predefined inheritance. If we look at unequal division by the portfolio composition, we observe a similar pattern. So focusing on the left side here, so these are so here we see estates that contain business wealth, and here we see estates that do not contain business wealth. And we see that the share of unequally divided estates is larger among those which contain business wealth. It's also slightly larger when we compare estates with and without land, but this is much less pronounced. And interestingly, if we look at real estate, however, estates that contain real estate are actually less likely to be unequally divided. And so our intuition about the importance of certain assets is particularly pronounced in terms of business wealth. Yes.
I wonder how, because your measure is quite strict, it's like whether you have business or not. And then I guess if you are in this category of richness to be taxed,
Yeah.
everyone tends to be in all categories, no? So these probably are like very rare combinations, etc. There's not many numbers in this case of people. So maybe you could have a different definition, like whether your wealth is mostly composed of businesses or mostly composed of real estate, because you know you have like very rare people who only have real estate, only have business, only have.
Maybe, so this is not all, so these are not the like it's not mutually exclusive. So it's whether they have it or not. So they could, if it says they have a business, they could also have real estate in it.
I think it would be like whether they have like half percentage of business, what
Yeah.
percentage is.
No, so like, yes, you're completely right. So this is actually what we plan to do next, to look at different combinations. But so these are actually the broadest category when we look at the asset that is possible, because this category could also include real estate or land estate. But I think I agree with you that it would be important to look a bit more at the composition.
And in that respect, maybe you could also see whether there is differences in the amount of money being transferred within different categories. Because I guess if you have stocks or money, financial wealth, it's easier to transfer it via like, I don't know, tax havens or other places. Whereas you have like real estate, art, anything that have like value that is very easy to assess by the state, it's very difficult to hide. And there's also, so people can check who you are giving it to whom. Whereas like perhaps in businesses, if you want to do it inequally, you'll do it inequally via the Cayman Island and not necessarily via the German system. It would be interesting to see. Maybe you can get like some famous people in your data set that are from Germany, and are also like in the Forbes, and see like how much of your wealth that is being transferred match the wealth that is in the Forbes, for instance. To see whether there is like a big part of it is actually being transferred via like non-official mechanism.
Yeah, no, that's an interesting point. I mean, we're covering like the official estates, right? So with the register data, we cannot observe tax avoidance or other transfers that have not been included in the registers. But yeah, I would think about this. Thank you. Yes.
So if a family gave, say, a business to a son and a comparable value of real estate, a building to a daughter, would they count as an unequal division in your study?
So at the moment, so when we, yes, so the short answer is yes. And but it depends on, so when we split it by portfolio composition, so here it would be, so if we look at whether it contains a business or not, in your example, that would then figure as unequally divided. But if we look at it as real estate, that would also figure as unequally divided, because it would include the unequal division between the sons. But yes, yeah, thank you. Okay, so if we look at, if I may continue and look now at the share of estates that include predefined inheritances by portfolio composition, we also see a very similar pattern. but if we not look at the share of unequal division, but portfolio, but the share of predefined inheritances. And here again, we have states that contain businesses, they are more likely to contain predefined inheritances, whereas when we look at states that do not, that do contain real estate, then it's the other way around, that those without real estate, they are more likely to contain predefined inheritance. With estates that include land, the differences are not very pronounced. So when we then turn to investigating the relationship between certain asset types and unequal division more carefully by looking more at the relationship between the share of these assets within the estate, we also observe kind of the same pattern, that the larger the share of the business within the estate, the more likely is it that the estate is unequally distributed. But we also see that the intensity, the extent to which it is more unequally distributed is also increasing here with the result, including the coefficient operation as outcome variable. We also again observe a positive relationship between unequal division and the share of land. But for the share of real estate, the association is very small and the coefficient is actually negative. So here we don't see increasing propensity of unequal division or intensity of unequal division with higher shares of real estate. And we kind of speculate at the moment that this is also because a lot of estates do contain real estate, and that it's mostly the other kinds of assets, in particular business assets, that drive unequal division. In order to see whether unequal division varies along the estate distribution, I've brought you these two plots. So on the x-axis, we have the estate distribution, so indicated in terms of percentiles. And on the y-axis, on the left panel, we see the share of unequal division. And we see actually strong variation across the distribution, with those at the very top being very likely. So it's more than 50% of the states at the top of the estate distribution that are divided unequally. And the same pattern can be observed if we look at the presence of predefined inheritances in the estate. So we do find evidence that unequal division seems to be particularly strong at the top. So which practices then drive the unequal division of the estate? So we run these estate fixed effects regression where inheritance value for from each of for the children is figure as the outcome value, as the outcome variable. And if we run the models, including a variable for the gender of the recipient being male and the recipient being firstborn, we find that male heirs receive on average 240,000 euro more than their sisters. And this association or this difference is statistically significant. The association is in fact actually negative when we look at the birth order, and the association is not significant. And when we include this in the same model, the pattern kind of stays the same. So we only observe significant differences in inheritance value for between men and women, and not in terms of birth order. And if we also introduce an interaction, so the idea that it might be the firstborn, the interaction is not significant. So it's really more about gender differences here rather than about birth order differences. And to test patrilineality, we then include an interaction between the variable for being a male recipient with the gender of the testator, and we here see the interaction, which is positive, meaning that the gender differences between recipients is actually even larger if the testator is a man. So it seems that we do find evidence here for patrilineality that particularly men, who drive these differences among brothers and daughters. And if we include an interaction between the gender of the recipient and the presence of structuring assets, we also find a larger gender gap. So a positive interaction here that would increase the gender gap between recipients. So again, evidence that unequal estate division is pronounced in the presence of certain types of assets here, businesses and land. So coming to our final question, what is the impact of unequal estate division on inequality and inheritance? We conduct this counterfactual analysis, and we do so by observing or calculating 3 types of inequality measures for the observed distribution of inheritance, which is indicated in black. So we use the tile index, the Gini index, and the ratio between the top 10 percentile and the bottom 10 percentile, because measures are sensitive to different parts in the distribution. And if we look at all transfers, we see that there's the Gini index and the tile index are actually quite similar if we kind of reallocate transfers equally. There's a slight reduction for the P90 divided P10 indicator, showing or indicating that most inequalities are actually occurring at the top. And if we split this by again, different asset types, we also don't see much difference for the Gini and the tile. But if we look at the last indicator, we see some reductions in inequality among business and land transfers. But it's very subtle, actually. So overall, if we want to put here the decrease in percentages, it's around a decrease of 5% in inequality if inheritances were transferred equally among siblings. So the next steps is that we would like to have a more detailed description of the portfolio composition. So that I think relates to your question. So we would want to look at how many assets actually only have businesses, only land, real estate, property, and then the different combinations of the 3 types of assets in order to get a better sense of which types of assets actually drive the unequal division, and whether there could be some compensatory mechanisms, as I think was also alluded to, like an unequal division of the business, but an equal division of the house, or that is split into different members of the family. And we would also like to look at strict impartiality. So here we just looked at whether it's unequally divided or not, but it would also be, I think, interesting and important to look whether there are certain types of assets that are just given in their unity to one child. And what we haven't done so far in the estate fixed effects regressions is that we have not introduced the interaction with the estate with the position in the estate distribution to see variation also along the value of the estate. So in conclusion, we find that in Germany, a substantial share of the estate is divided unequally, so the share amounts to 38%. This unequal division is more common in the presence of structuring assets, and in particular business assets, and at the top of the distribution. And we find a similar pattern if we not only look at the inheritance value, but actually predefine inheritance as a device of unequal division. And so we would conclude that we do find evidence for unequal estate, that unequal estate division contributes to wealth perpetuation, in particular for the rich, and that unequal estate division is mainly achieved through patrilineality. So meaning that it is realized through and to the benefits of man, and that at least in our data, we don't find evidence for primogeniture as a practice through which unequal division is achieved, even in combination with patrilineality. And so the counterfactual analysis revealed that that the inheritance inequality would be lower by around 5% if estates were divided equally among children. And with this, thank you very much.
Thank you very much for the presentation, which I know is dear to a lot of people's hearts in the room. If the online audience would like to ask questions, please raise your hand in the chat, or else post your question in the chat stating your name and affiliation where possible. So we'll first take a question from the room. And please, Mike, go.
Yeah, I've got a clarification question really, and is who does the valuation of these assets? You might have said, but I missed it.
Yeah, I haven't said this. Thank you for asking. So how this data is generated is that if families need to file a tax claim form when a person dies and when they expect to have an inheritance, and it's essentially the authorities that then value the land and the house. So there's rates depending on the location of the house, and so there's values depending on the location and also the age of the property. And with businesses, it depends on whether it's valuated, for instance, on the stock market or not. Yeah, but it's not the family that is kind of doing the evaluation.
So I guess I was leading to two different thoughts on that. And that one is, how much evidence do you see of the reverse accounting that Bézier and Gola described in their book in the French system? And secondly, if the families aren't doing the valuing, it sounds like it's done as a part of the official process. If perhaps for Annette's question, if they've sort of predetermined that someone's going to get the business and someone's going to get the house, that could lead to sort of an inequality because of the official valuation that's placed on it, whereas in the family's mind, they feel perhaps that those things are equal. So I just wondered a bit about how you'd explored or thought about that. A comment.
Yes, no, thank you very much. I think it's very important. Unfortunately, I think we can't, we only have the data on the official distribution and evaluation, so we can't kind of see to what extent it deviates from what the family has had in mind. But I think we would certainly need to think more about this, whether there's some way of kind of bringing this together, or at least we should properly discuss this also with respect to the possibility of reverse accounting. Thank you.
Mike?
Thank you. That was wonderful. I mean, really fantastically interesting and very close to our interests, looking at gender wealth divides. I mean, are you able to do geographical analysis? Because one thing that struck me is whether there might be some religious, please say Catholic areas and Protestant areas, which might tease out, and whether that's something which.
Yes, thank you. Yes, it would be great to do this. So we do have information on the location of the tax offices. So this is the only geographical indicator that we have, and we have thought about including this as a predictor. But the problem is a little bit that these tax authorities, they are not distributed equally across the regions, and they don't map clearly distinct areas. And also they also change over time, so it's not very obvious. So we can't do this, unfortunately. But yeah, it would be great to do it. Thank you.
Yeah, go.
Thanks very much. Super interesting. First, I mean, I also had the same question as Liz. So what if families, assign different assets or estates to children because they think their worth isn't this much, and then the state says otherwise? And I was wondering, so that was also my earlier question on, is it this unequal 38% is exactly 50%? What if you had something like a plus minus 10% or so around that, which might mean families actually thought it was more or less, I mean, 10%, I'm making that up now, but as something that might give us a better indication if there was intentional unequal division or so. Secondly, I was wondering if you have information on whether or not the children who inherit, say, real estate or the structural assets in particular businesses might have already lived in those flats, houses, whatever, or already worked in the business, because I could imagine there's all kinds of other fairness considerations that when we think about equality, we might also care about, rather than just how do we actually divide this. So if someone has already lived if I live in my parents' house or flat that they own, but I also renovate it and I maintain it, I might have more of a claim to it than just the financial value. I might have contributed to that even, and then my sibling who might have worked in the family business already and contributed to that a lot, might know it a lot, can run it better than me, for example. So I was just wondering to what extent you could bring that in, if at all. And then finally, just a clarification, I was very confused by your answer to that earlier question. So if I have two children, Javier and Pedro, and I have real estate worth 100,000 euros and a business worth 100,000 euros, and I give full asset to each of them, is that perfectly equal or perfectly unequal?
Unequal.
That doesn't make sense to me. I don't understand that. So if I have 200,000 and I give 100,000 to each, based on your motivation that what you want to capture is that we actually divide overall family wealth, I divide the financial equivalent perfectly equal among my children. No? So if you're worried with, so the only way I would achieve this is by giving 50% of each asset to both of my children, right?
So if it's, so if they are, so it would be perfectly equal if they are both of equal value.
Exactly.
But if they are not, then it would be considered unequal. So if the house is, for instance, so because the unequal division is calculated on the level of the value of the asset. So it's, so if it was a house 200 and a business 200 and they would be given to different children, that would be equal. But if the business is slightly 500 and the house is 100 and that would be distributed to different children, that would be considered unequal.
Okay, but if they're equal, and then let's say the business after valuation is 210 and the real estate is 190, but actually at the point where I wrote my will, I thought they're more or less the same, probably. In that case, you might think they're actually equal.
Yes, sorry. Yes. Yes, thank you so much. Sorry also for answering right away the last question, but that links also, I think, to your first one about calculating or establishing maybe different kinds of thresholds for unequal division. I think, yeah, we played around with the +2, 9, plus minus 2% deviation from the essentially previous research, but I think we could kind of do more and to see when do our results actually differ. So we will do that, and then so unfortunately we don't have a lot of information on the children and also the test except for their birth date and their gender. So we don't know whether they live in the parents' house. We actually also don't know whether they live close by. So this is a limitation. But actually, Daria and Manuel and I, we ran a survey experiment to actually get at parents' perceptions and attitudes about parental transfers and how that differs by asset types. And we actually also included a condition whether children are working in their parents' business or not, and we let people essentially evaluate vignettes on children, like two siblings that receive inheritance from their parents with different types of assets, and then it would include family business in one scenario, and then we also make them work in the family business or not. And interestingly, this survey experiment was also run in Germany, and interestingly, we see that overall people actually favor equal division. So when it comes to attitudes and fairness evaluations, it's actually a different picture than from the behavior that we kind of observe in our text data. But it's true that if one child is working in the family, this is considered less unfair if this child is getting or is receiving a larger share of the family business. But still, overall, it's still considered unfair. So the child is still considered to have received too much compared to this situation where they have not worked in the business. It's slightly lower. But one very interesting thing is also that this is mainly driven by those with high amounts of wealth. So this kind of justification for being involved in the parental business, we can only observe among highly rich respondents in our sample, and for people with lower wealth, we actually don't see that. So they, regardless of whether the child has worked in the business or not, this is considered to be too much or too unfair, or unfair. Yeah.
Okay, so we'll go here then here.
Following the question by Mike, I was thinking that could you see some differences between generations? Maybe the generation that were dying out from like previous generation, they have like more gender inequality and they were like giving it more to the sons, whether like more recent death from people who were like was born later, perhaps they're changing out their habits and having like a more like gender equal distribution. That would be one thing. And the other was this more like a theoretical question because you said you didn't have the data, but then that you give unequally your state to your family, to your descendant doesn't mean necessarily you're creating inequality. Because you also can give like unequally your assets as a corrective measure. So I have like two, like a family of two, one is not working right now, is like in trouble, the other is already working and well established in this profession, then maybe I would like to give more to the one that is less established than to the other. And then you are measuring this as an inequality. I mean, an inequality that's seeking to correct the underlying issue. In the same way that the government, the welfare state, gives unequal transfers all the time because it's basically targeting the ones in more need, in theory. So maybe is there any way to see this in your data, perhaps like, maybe not in the top 0.1%, but then the rest of the families, maybe they're giving their assets differently as a way to kind of create equality within the inheritance.
Yes.
It's not necessarily banned that they are giving like an equal transfer.
Yes, thank you so much. With regard to your first question, unfortunately, so we haven't looked at this, so differences between birth cohorts. We could probably do this because we know the birth dates of the people who have died and who leave the bequest behind. So yeah, thank you for that hint. Regarding your theoretical question, so yes, I think this is certainly something that we also discussed a lot about. To like what are kind of the motivations of parents, and like unequal treatment can also be to just level the differences between the siblings. And maybe one argument here is that these are bequests that normally children receive rather late in their life, right? Normally, I think mean age of inheritance is around 50, between 50 and 60. So it's not so much when it's about giving like or compensating for inequalities in education and qualifications or so on. I would expect this to happen much earlier than later. So when it's more about interlegal gifts and transfers rather than inheritances. And also so we are here mostly also focusing on wealth perpetuation. So how can family maintain their wealth over time? And we would take it, we see that unequal division is particularly prevalent at the top, and this is why we would argue that this is something in evidence for that. But it's true that at the lower end of the distribution, it could be that there are some other driving motivations that lead to unequal division. But yeah, we unfortunately can only look at how things are transferred and inherited, and not so much about the motivations themselves. Thank you.
Thank you. That was a super interesting discussion, not least as somebody with 7 brothers and sisters. I had a couple of questions. First, whether you are able to distinguish between sort of actively managed family businesses and a business in the sense that I might own a share of somebody else's business, but I don't actually contribute to the running of it, which seems to me a lot easier to split up. The second was whether you're able to observe, in terms of the patrilineality issue, whether you're able to observe whether the spouse has already died. It would seem to me like it would be if a father man passes their family business on to their son while their wife is still alive, that seems to be particularly strong evidence of patrilineality, as opposed to like it just being the firstborn son that if say the mother is already dead. And I also was wondering, in kind of like the same way, but actually totally the opposite end of the distribution, to the question about the counterfactual. I'm not surprised in a way that like all the estates, it kind of ends up being a bit of a wash, because you showed yourself that like it is mostly right up the top of the distribution where this is happening. So I imagine that you would get some much larger numbers if you're just looking at inequality within the top 10% or inequality within the top 1%. I was wondering if you looked at that.
Yes, thank you. So we don't unfortunately have information on the involvement or the potential involvement in the business.
But like just typed, like, do you have like an asset type? Is it just kind of like, do you know how these things are categorized?
Yeah, so it's so in the tax declaration, it's categorized just as business owner, like it's ownership. It's not about management. So we also thought about this, but we unfortunately don't have the data or the information on this. So this is here when we talk about business wealth, it's really about ownership. So obviously there could be some differences to this, but this is what we observe. Then the question about, or the comment about, looking at whether the spouse is still alive or not. I think, this is a very good idea. We could, I'm not sure whether we actually can do this, because in the tax declaration, it's like, it's information on the person who has died and all the people who receive it. So we actually don't know whether the partner is still alive. But given that we see that it's actually mostly women who pass, well, like the share of female testatus is higher, but then it's mainly men who receive it, but then also that they receive more if it's given to them by their father. This is what we take to be supportive of patrilineality. And could you remind me of your last?
Oh, just whether you get a stronger kind of evidence of the contribution to overall inequality if you're just looking at the top inequality within the top.
Yes, so I think we haven't done this yet. We just looked at the P90, P10. This would be the first indicator, but I think we can certainly zoom into it more closely. Thank you. Yes.
Great.
Yeah, just super interesting. I was just wondering regarding the patrilineality, could you just control for whether there is an actual sister within the family who can inherit? Because I'm just wondering how much this is very old people that maybe don't even have children and they're like, giving a bequeathment to someone who is completely outside of their family.
Yes, no, we can certainly do this because we know the gender of all heirs, so that's a fantastic idea, I think. Yes.
Just one minor comment following this, but maybe what you could do, because you don't have data on the whether you could work or not in the businesses, but maybe you can take like a very small sample of the top 0.1%, but probably their businesses are like, you can see them publicly in the internet, so you can see like whether their sons or daughters are in the management board or are part of the business already, and this information like probably in the internet are probably available. Because there are like probably listed companies, so they must make this information available.
Yeah, I mean, we will only have this approximation because we get this information from the statistical offices, so we have to go to the statistical offices to run the analysis, and it's completely anonymized, so we don't know which kind of business this is. I mean, obviously, if we know the date of death of the person, how much they left behind, and kind of the close area, we could make educated guesses about this. And check this, but it's not the case that we have the precise information on the business. So that would be maybe the
As a sociologist of the family, I wondered if you've worried about the issue of divorce and remarriage. Because of course the divorce rate is lower for people who are wealthier, but it's non-trivial. I was just looking at, it looks like the divorce rate in Germany now is about a third, but it's been as high as 50%. And of course, there's a different culture around giving to stepchildren versus biological children. I wonder if you've worried about that or thought about trying to combine divorce records.
Yeah, this is an excellent point. Thank you. So we haven't thought about this or modeled this explicitly, but I think the tax data would allow us to look into this, especially when it comes to stepchildren and biological children, because I would need to check this, but if there were differences in the amount of tax, so this is all the information that we have depends on the regulations surrounding the amount of tax that certain kin have to pay. So if there's a difference, we could probably look at differences in inheritance practices depending on whether it's biological children or not. So yeah, thank you for this.
Okay, I'm sorry that we've run out of time for questions. So if I didn't get to you, please maybe try and talk to Nhat and afterwards. But before I ask you to join me in thanking her, a brief announcement that from next week, the seminars will be moving to a different room, CKK 204. So look out for announcements, but hopefully see many of you there. But otherwise, please join me in thanking Nhat Ann for a fantastic presentation.